The auto-thrust controls are the thrust levers. The flight guidance system provides auto-thrust for flight operations after takeoff. The auto-thrust controls are the thrust levers. Auto-thrust is normally engaged after takeoff by movement of the thrust levers aft to the climb power position. Autothrust is not available while toga or flex thrust is set. When autothrust is engaged, the thrust levers remain stationary, although the thrust values constantly change as determined by the FMGS. Autothrust can be used to maintain a target speed or to maintain a target thrust level. Specific autopilot flight director vertical modes determine the autothrust speed or thrust mode. Speed mode example. When the vertical mode controls the vertical rate, the autothrust mode is speed. Examples of this are altitude hold, vertical speed, flight path angle, glide slope, and so forth. Thrust mode example. When the vertical mode adjusts pitch to maintain a target speed, the auto-thrust mode is thrust. Examples of this are climb and descent. In the power plant modules, you learn the operation of the thrust levers and their detents. When auto-thrust is off, movement of the thrust levers provides a conventional operation. There are 3 detents for the use of forward thrust. They are climb thrust, flex max continuous thrust, takeoff or go-around thrust. As the thrust levers are retarded, there is a stop at idle, and autothrust is not available at idle or below. The position of the thrust lever determines the maximum thrust available that can be commanded by the auto-thrust system. With the auto-thrust on, the available thrust is used by auto-thrust during climbs and also when accelerating in the speed mode. On the engine warning display, the thrust setting limit of the thrust lever is displayed by a symbol, the thrust lever angle indicator, and the actual thrust is represented by the green radial line and digital readout. Autothrust can be disconnected off, armed, or active on. On the ground, autothrust is off. There is no light in the autothrust push button on the FCU and no autothrust indications on the FMA. When autothrust is off, the crew must manually set the power required for taxi and takeoff. When cleared for takeoff, the pilot flying will move the thrust levers to stabilize at EPR 1.05 and then advance them to either the flex detent or toga detent as required for the specific takeoff. This action arms the auto-thrust. In this example, we will set thrust at toga. The display of manual toga in white in the Flight Mode Annunciator Auto Thrust column indicates the thrust is manually controlled and is set at the toga thrust level, which is the maximum thrust available for takeoff. Additionally, Autothrust appears in blue in the FMA Autothrust Engagement Status column to indicate Autothrust is armed, and the green Autothrust push-button lights in the FCU come on. After takeoff with Autothrust armed and climbing through the thrust reduction altitude, the pilot moves the thrust levers to the climb detent. The reminder to the pilot to perform this action is a flashing lever climb prompt. Moving the thrust levers to climb activates the autothrust. The blue autothrust armed indication changes to white to indicate the autothrust is active, and the green thrust climb display indicates the autothrust mode is climb. Since the thrust levers are in the climb detent, the autopilot commands a climb in the vertical axis, and the pitch will be adjusted to maintain the climb schedule target speed. With both engines operating, the autothrust will remain engaged when the thrust levers are placed at any position between idle and the climb detent. With one engine inoperative, the autothrust will remain engaged when the thrust levers are placed at any position between idle and the MCT detent. Normally, the crew will leave the thrust levers in the climb position throughout the flight until the flare, and the autothrust will set power as required between idle and climb power. During autothrust operations, if the pilot needs additional thrust at any time, movement of the levers forward of the climb detent allows manual thrust control. When this action is taken, manual thrust displays white on the FMA as the operating mode, and autothrust displays in blue to indicate the autothrust is armed for future activation. Returning the thrust levers to the climb detent will reactivate the autothrust. During the climb, the autothrust is set to the thrust climb mode to indicate maximum climb power. When the aircraft approaches the target altitude, the FMA vertical column changes from climb or open climb to altitude capture, and then altitude, or altitude cruise if the target altitude is the cruise altitude. The FMA autothrust will change from thrust mode to the speed or Mach mode. Recall that the autothrust is in speed mode when autopilot or flight director vertical modes are altitude hold, vertical speed, or flight path angle. The autothrust is also in speed mode during the vertical mode of glide slope or any approach. The target speed will either be determined by the FMGS while operating in the managed mode or by the FCU speed selector knob while operating in the selected mode. During manual flight with autothrust in the speed mode, the pilot must manually move the thrust levers to idle during the flare. If this is not accomplished, the autothrust will attempt to maintain the target speed during the flare and landing. As a crew reminder, a retard automatic call is provided at 20 feet AGL. During autoflight with autothrust in the speed mode, the FMGS will command the engine thrust to idle during the flare. A retard automatic call is provided at 10 feet AGL to remind the pilot to position the thrust levers to idle for reversing. When the thrust levers are moved to idle, the autothrust will disconnect. Therefore, the FMA autothrust column will blank, and the green lights in the autothrust push button extinguish. The autothrust can be disconnected at any time by the crew. To disconnect the autothrust without unexpected thrust variations, use this technique. 1. Move the thrust levers back so the thrust lever angle indicator is matched to the current EPR radial needle. Then, 2. Press the instinctive disconnect push button momentarily. This method will give the indications of a voluntary disconnect. For voluntary disconnection, a temporary amber auto thrust off message is displayed on the right lower part of ECAM upper DU. Note: do not push the instinctive disconnect push button for more than 15 seconds, as this action will inhibit auto thrust operation for the rest of the flight. This long disconnect procedure is designed to inhibit auto thrust during undesirable auto thrust performance. The auto thrust can also be disconnected by pressing the auto thrust push button on the FCU, but this method is not recommended because it will give indications of an involuntary auto thrust disconnect. In case of involuntary disconnection, amber auto thrust off and engine thrust locked messages are displayed in the left lower part of ECAM upper DU. To turn the auto thrust to on again after a disconnect, press the auto thrust push button on the FCU, then set the thrust levers in the climb detent. This completes the introduction to the auto thrust system. Now let's answer some questions.